Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Novelists Unwind. I'm very excited to be here today in our virtual Adirondack chairs along the beach with author Jane Kirkpatrick. She's been writing for, close to 30 years now, is that right?
Right.
Award-winning author of many books and mostly historical. And she's very well known for the attention to detail and research that she brings to her stories. So we're going to talk today about her writing journey and about her latest release and the book I'm currently reading, The Road We Traveled. So I'm in the middle of it right now. It's really, really good. So Jane, why don't we just start out by telling us a little bit how you decided you wanted to be a writer, became a writer, a little bit about that writing journey.
Well, I always loved words. I thought words were really funny. I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, and I remember my older sister one time, I asked her what this little fluttering thing was over a pond of water, and she told me it was a butterfly. And I thought, I know what butter is, and I know what a fly is, and that's not either of those. And so I always thought words were funny, and I enjoyed the sounds of words and making up words. And so I used to write little poems when I was younger.
Oh,
And then through my school years, I had teachers who were very kind and said, "Oh, you have an interesting way of saying things." And
wow.
but I didn't journal. I didn't write for anybody else to write anything or to read, I should say, until we were making a decision to make a major life change. I was the director of a mental health program in Bend, Oregon, which is actually where we live now. We came back,
Mm-hmm.
and my husband was a contractor, and we decided to leave everything here and move to what I called Rattlesnake and Rock Ranch, which was 160 acres of just sagebrush, and there was a spring there, he said. Lots of rattlesnakes, and a beautiful river. And so we left everything and moved in 1984. But before we did that, I mean, we had the property 5 years, and I was just like, I just don't think I can do this. What will I do down there? I worried that we'd kill each other and be dead for weeks. We didn't know anyone there. We were 7 miles from the mailbox.
Oh, wow.
So I was really struggling with what I would do. And then this kind of wonderful inner voice said, "Write." And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. What would I? So I took a class at our local community college, and Bob Welch, I don't know if you know that name, but he's won some gold medallion awards.
Okay.
Now he's a columnist for the Eugene Register Guard here in Oregon. He's written some wonderful books, 52 Life Lessons for Les Miserables, and
Oh,
things. And so he was my first instructor. He was
wow.
a sports writer for the local paper, and both of us were just nervous wrecks. He had a class of about 12, I think, and I was sure they would see this little fraud sign popping on. But as a result of that, he was very encouraging, and I was actually able to sell some of my assignments, the nonfiction.
Nice.
And so then we moved, and I sold nonfiction to magazines and newspapers, and then decided maybe I could tell the story of our journey of sort of taking a risk and changing our lives. And so that book came out in 1991. It was called Homestead,
Mm.
and it's still in print. And then after that, I was like, okay, I've done my book. Everybody has at least one book in them.
Right.
Yes. And so but I'd read in a historical novel or a historical journal about this couple that in the 1860s lived in a remote area. They were trying to build a life in a remote part of, Oregon. The age difference between Jane Shear and her husband was the same as the age difference between my husband and I, 16 years.
Oh, wow.
And he had been a builder, which my husband had been, and they had no children of their own, and we have no children of our own. And then they were able to succeed because of how they got along with their neighbors, and their neighbors Wasco, Warm Spring, and Paiute people, and I was working for that tribe, those three tribes. So I wanted to tell their story, and I could find lots of things about him, his, and her
Mhm.
brother and her father. And if they'd had sons, I could have found out things about the son, but very little about her, except a little essay that I had read, and then her obituary, which was just, in the old days, they used to write really glowing obituaries, of
Yeah.
how people had affected the lives of the community. And this was just a precious obituary. And it talked about how the Indian people had come and stayed and waited for sunrise for the burial, came and visited her through the night. It was very moving. And so I had this question of, well, what had she done? What might she have done that would have made them love her so much? And so that began my journey. I thought I would try to write a biography, but I just couldn't find out enough about her. And then I came across this wonderful quote from Virginia Woolf, who said, "Women's history must be invented, both uncovered and made up." So that set me on my path to writing novels based on the lives of historical women.
I love that. And I read that in some of the material, that was given to me, and just thought how true that is. In my own family, we have my mom's paternal line going back to the late 1700s, and her mother's paternal line going
Yeah.
back to the late 1700s. But the women are just names. There's nothing about
I
them.
know. Sometimes when I'm doing, because I do genealogy, I do,
Hmm.
try to talk to descendants. And with I did a 3-book series. And when I went to the Historical Society that really kind of honors this, the Aurora Colony was called, they had the family tree that traced the boys all the way through. But I knew from the census record that she'd had 2 girls.
Uh,
They didn't have any information on that. So I included that in the first book. And one of the descendants said to me, "I love the book, but you made up the part about the girls, right?" And I said, "No, she had 2 girls and 2 boys." And so I gave her their married names. And she said, "I've heard those names my whole life, but no one ever said that they were the sisters of these 2 boys, because we always only heard about the boys."
oh,
So
wow.
yeah, it's fun helping descendants rediscover their families.
Hmm.
Um, and most of these women, I would say, are that I write about, they would call themselves ordinary. They were
Yes,
just ordinary women, but I think they were extraordinary. And I
absolutely.
like to sort of explore what about their life is really close to what is about our life.
Hmm.
How can I help them step from that place to this place, and maybe help us learn some things about who we are, as women, or as couples, or as moms, or stepmoms, or whatever the case may be.
I like one of the things that I read that you said was that you said your life changed forever because you trusted. It was stepping out into a cloud of faith, believing I wouldn't fall through. And I
Yeah,
had, just because I'm reading the road we traveled, right? The road
right.
we traveled. Um, Tabitha pretty much says exactly the same thing to her daughter when they're talking about making this trip to Oregon. So
Yes.
I was wondering what came first. Did you have those thoughts about yourself and you gave this to Tabitha, or did it
Well,
come through writing Tabitha's story and then you're saying, yeah, that's me too?
yeah, for me writing it, I think I had those thoughts first, because that's what was the big life-changing thing when we went to
Mm-hmm.
um and at the time we had the property. My husband said, "I want to go there badly enough for both of us." And I know,
And you're going, hmm?
and I know, because I said, if I go for you, then when things get rough, and I knew they would get rough, then I would not like me, and I have to trust that there's something here for me, that
Mm-hmm.
I'm having the same sort of call that you're having to go to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that was true for Tabitha. She was the wife of a pastor who her husband had died many years before. So she was been a widow for many years, supported her children through teaching. And in 1845, when she was 66 years old, her adult children said, we're all heading off to Oregon, and because they really loved her, but they said, we just don't think you can make it because you're old, and because she was lame, and
Right.
you had to walk on the Oregon Trail. So um, she, of course, was very strong-willed and decided, to buy her own wagon or hire her own wagon, and then talked her 78-year-old brother-in-law into going with her. And so, and I think that added to that sense of responsibility that, she talked him into going, and then things got rough. And in sort of that sort of trial of, who am I now? Am I responsible for this? I didn't want to be a burden to my family. And I think those are all thoughts that I certainly had at the time that we were making this move, and then terrible things did happen. We were in a terrible plane crash, and my parents had to
Mm-hmm.
take care of us, and
Oh, wow.
other people's lives were engaged in our little experiment to go homestead. So um, having that cloud of trust, that it doesn't always look very secure,
Right.
when you're out there, but it has all the firmament that we need to keep going, because
Oh, I love that. I love the picture of it when I read it in the story. And then when, read it again, I thought, oh, that is so cool. That's really, really neat. Well, we need to talk about your newest book, which comes out in September. Is that
it does.
right?
And I have the approved reader
Oh,
copy, right?
good, because I do not have a copy. All She Left Behind. Also about a woman, a real live woman,
Yeah.
and tell us
So
about Jenny.
let me first tell you, sometimes people say, well, where do you get your ideas? Where do you find these women?
Yes.
Sandra Dallas, who is a writer I really love, and she said, when I asked if she would read the book for endorsement, she said, where do you find these people? They're just fascinating. And this one, I had written a book 20 years ago, and in it I had mentioned the name of an Indian agent. And when that book came out, it was called Love to Water My Soul. So I had written this book, and I had mentioned the name of an Indian agent, and a woman had written to me, and she said, oh, that man, and his name was Josiah Parrish. She
Mhm.
said he was an early missionary, came to Oregon, and he's my ancestor.
Oh,
And,
wow.
oh, really? And she said, and his wife, and at the time I didn't know it was his second wife because his first wife had passed away, but she said his wife was the first woman physician to serve children and women in Portland. And I thought, oh, that's really kind of interesting, women physicians. But I put that in a little back burner. And this
Right.
one, she became a wonderful fan. She read all my books. Her name was Audrey Slater. She'd come to all my events and so on. And through the years, that little story kept, percolating back there until 2 years ago. I think I talked to my editor and said, I think I'd like to write this story about this woman.
Mhm.
Excuse me. Um, and so I was in contact with Audrey, and she had kind of a history of her husband, Mr. Parrish, but only one mention of her, and that was a copy of the diploma that she got from Willamette University Medical School in 1879. So then I set about trying to find out who this woman was. And this is a wonderful aside, but about 3 years ago, a woman who I'd never met had moved from Tennessee to Portland, had written me this lovely letter that said, I've been reading your books for years. My daughter's now in school, and I just tried to, I really felt like, well, maybe there's something that the Lord is directing me to offer. And she said, I don't know if I could help you, but I would love if there's anything I could do.
Oh, wow.
And it turns out, like me, she was trained as a social worker in mental health,
Mhm.
but her specialty was medical research. And so I said, well, I can't really afford a researcher. I just do it all myself, basically. But
Mhm.
if you wanted to explore some sites and maybe make some trips, I could pay your expenses. And she said, oh, that'd be great. So she, goes to the medical, libraries and finds all this wonderful material. We still didn't find much about Jenny. And then she said, her husband was a missionary. He was a Methodist missionary. Let's contact the Philadelphia archives for the Methodist Church. And sure enough, there was a huge file on him, and in it were all kinds of things about Jenny,
Oh,
including
great.
her will, newspaper articles, receipts for when she bought her medical books, just lovely little things. And then we found out that they had these 2 children and that he was 37 years older than her.
Wow.
And so, but we also found some things that were really kind of hard parts of her story. And when I realized some of those, one of which is that she had a son who had a terrible alcohol addiction. And it was a time in the West when alcohol just ran freely, and people tried to deal with it. But it was, the streets of Portland and Salem just had saloons,
Mm-hmm.
and it just destroyed families, and they had no money, and children were without food because it'd get all drunk up. And
Sure.
so here was her son, and it turns out her first husband also had an alcohol problem. So I contacted my friend Audrey and I said, well, here's where the story's taking me. Are you still okay that I explore? She said, absolutely. You find out whatever you want, whatever you can. We just are interested in knowing what her life was like and what she might have to teach us. And so the story really unfolded with me kind of exploring when you have a dream and then there are these challenges that come before you, what kinds of things do you have to leave behind in order to move forward? And so, some of that is feeling guilty because she wasn't
Mm-hmm.
able to do what she wanted to do with her son or her first husband, anger, frustration, all kind of emotional weights that we carry around. And if we carry them into the future, we risk not being able to have room for the good gifts that God has planned for us.
That's so true. And I guess you probably went through some of that too when you were doing the whole homestead
Yes,
thing,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. So all of that, and just that, I just think we all, when we make a decision to move, let's say, you think, oh
Yes.
gosh, is this the right time? Should we have done this now? My husband is older now and he has a lot of health problems, and I'm
Mhm.
like, should I, should I, should I take this event and lead this women's retreat, or should I stay home with him? And so there
Right.
are all kinds of strains, but we are given tools of imagination and compassion and friends, and I think that was one of the things that really unveiled itself in this story, was how many people Jenny had in terms of family and other friends that really came forward to help support her as she moved
Yeah.
towards this goal. She was actually married with kids before she went to medical school.
Yeah, I read that, and that's just, and you said how amazing it was for a woman, any woman, to go to
Yeah,
medical school, but for her to have children and go to medical school was just
yeah, yeah.
almost
Oh,
unthinkable. Yeah, yeah.
I suspect that in some ways, because her other 2 colleagues who were in school with her, the 2
Hmm.
in her class, there were, I think, 9 in that first class that she was in, 3 women, and the 2 women were widows.
Oh, wow.
So, I think maybe there was some kind of sensibilities that, if a woman was going to treat a man, for example, that it would be
True.
better a married woman, because we wouldn't want to expose her to, amazing things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a story told about one of the early Oregon physicians, because Jenny was not the first. We did find that out. She wasn't early, because there weren't specialties. At that
Hmm.
time. She developed a specialty for women and children, in part because I think she had known what it was like to not be able to trust that your husband was going to bring home the paycheck, and how
Hmm.
are you going to feed your kids? So, and then to have, of course, the second love, which was, he just adored her, and was that much older, but it didn't make any difference. He just supported all of her goals and things
Oh,
that she
that's
did.
great.
So, and I can't remember what I was going to say, but it doesn't matter.
No, that's wonderful. I also like your takeaway from going back. Yeah, no, this one, All She Left Behind. That some things are worth doing regardless of how they turn out. And I
Yes.
think, lots of times we think, well, we can't even try to do something because we might fail, or, what if it doesn't, or if it doesn't turn out, then we're kind of embarrassed. But
Right.
you're right, there's value in just the trying and in the journey.
Yeah, I think we learn from that. I mean, if we do learn from that, it's why I tell people I don't like soap operas, because
Mhm.
those people have a lot of trouble and they make a lot of bad decisions, but they don't learn anything
They
from.
don't.
But I have found in all of these women that I have written about, one of the reasons why their story is still resonates with family members, and with others if they're more well known, is that when they hit a dead end, when they hit a challenge, they don't see it as the end. They don't see it that, oh, that was a big mistake. Now, I
Mhm.
never done that, and then carry that regret. They look at that and go, okay, what is it that I need to discover from this? To turn that into, helping me go back to what it was I really felt strongly about. It's like, instead of feeling unworthy, to say, well, no, what is it that, what was the lesson that I could get from this?
Um,
And what tools can I draw in? And how did I make my way through, or how will I make my way through? And I think that's one of the reasons why people read stories about, that are based on actual people, because it's inspiring and encouraging that this woman went through that. You
yes.
know, this is how she came through it. Yeah, she messed up. She
Mhm.
probably shouldn't have made that decision. And a good reader, good writers will have you going. I just finished a book that I was like paging ahead, because it's like, I don't think I can to find out whether or not how long are you going to make me wait. Um, and so, we have a tendency to stretch that out, but
Yes.
but I I do think that's one of the reasons why we read, is to find out how did she come to this resolution? How did she go from feeling so worthless as a mom, as a wife,
Mhm.
as a daughter? She had other kinds of problems. How did she go from there to making this major decision to remarry,
Yeah.
someone that much older, and then to finally listen to that inner voice that she felt so strongly about, to believe that maybe I could make a difference. Maybe I could do something. She had had some natural healing abilities with essential oils and
Oh,
things.
wow. Wow.
At the time, you either were kind of a natural healer, or
Mhm.
new kind of science of medicine. They called it, oops, my mind just went blank, but it was a new kind of science of medicine where you studied and then you also did surgeries and used
Right.
pharmaceuticals. And so
Mhm.
and that's what she wanted to do. She really felt like she was limited to some extent by the herbs and oils that she had, and wanted that additional information. So that too was a big decision, because it meant, that she had to go away for a year to get, surgical study back east, because they just didn't let
Right.
women do that on the West Coast. So, yeah. So,
Wow.
I think there are things for all of us to learn from that. Well,
That's,
now I got older, or my husband passed away, or, my kids have left home. Now, what am I going to do with my life? How will I continue to find purpose and meaning in my life? So I think we read to find those things out.
oh, I love that. Yeah, and I totally agree. That's great. Well, we're almost out of time, but I had a couple things I wanted to ask you about your research, because
Yeah.
it's impeccable. I mean, you talk about doing the genealogies. How long does it take you to write a book when you're having to do all this research as well as the writing, which are you a fast writer, slow writer?
I never thought of myself as fast or slow, but I believe from what my editors have said that I'm a fast writer,
Okay.
and that helps. And
Yeah.
so, and I sort of think in blocks. I'm kind
Hmm.
of compartmentalized, and so I do research, like because I have contracts. So I usually
Sure.
have coming out in September, and then I have a book due in September. So I've just finished the book that'll be coming out next year. So
Right.
finish that, and I'm still doing some research on that, because during revisions I'll have still things that I'm working.
Okay.
um, but from September until January, I'm basically promoting the book that came out, and I'm researching the next book.
Uh-huh.
And then I'm also working on revisions and edits of the book that'll come out like the next year.
Sure.
Uh, and then usually around sometime in April and May is when I just sit down and start writing. It's like, okay, I've got as much as I can get here. Uh,
Right.
and sometimes it's earlier. It's like, okay, everything I've read, I've already read. So that tells me that
Yeah.
a lot of new information, unless I can find a descendant to chat with about it. Love those, because they have all these family stories that give you insights about people. And then I'll write probably, I get up like at 4 in the morning, and I write, have breakfast, when my husband gets up, then I write again until noon. We have lunch together, and then I write until about 4. So I'm writing 8 to 10 hours a day, and I do that 5 days a week.
Wow.
When I have other appointments or something. And so it takes me about 2 months at that kind of a schedule to get it down. And then I come back and do revisions and let it sit for a little bit and still make my deadline in September. So that's sort of how it goes. And then I'm already thinking like, I've already been thinking about what's going to be the next book and we've started the research on that one. So yeah, it's, there's a schedule to some extent, but I also have just a lot of, I have a lot of freedom. And now I have things where I have to go back and go, oh, I remember when I wrote that book, this was going on, so that could have been relevant to this.
Sure. So that's helpful too.
Yes.
And you've done some practical things like writing in a stagecoach, so you know how that.
Yeah. At least sitting in one. I didn't go very
well. Sitting in one.
But you wouldn't want to, let me tell you. Yes. So the next book coming out has stagecoaches in it. And I think, wow, I just wouldn't want to be having to spend my life in there. And this woman did spend, the first 25 years of her marriage riding around in stagecoaches and, on horseback and trains eventually. But yeah, it's been, riding around with her for the last several months has been very interesting.
And that's a book that's like a whole year from now.
Yeah. I don't want to name that one. So.
Well, this has been so much fun. I really, I read your book, A Flickering Light, several years ago. A friend gave it to me. And I will tell you that book, still just every once in a while, something from that book pops into my head. And it was such I was just beginning to read what we know as inspirational fiction at that time, and appreciated that your story was different than a lot of the other stories I was reading.
Well, and that was my grandmother.
Yes, yeah. Your family.
And I'm glad you liked that. Yeah,
I really did. I really did appreciate reading that and seeing that. And of course, I do write contemporary romance now. But it's like, is this all this? Is that all the inspirational market is?
Yeah.
Contemporary romance, and of course, it's not. But yours was one of the first books I read that sort of took me into the genres that I really love to read. So
yeah,
that was really cool.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again for, I know like it's 8:30, it was 8:30 for you.
Yeah.
So early.
Well, I got up early anyway, but I had to actually look decent for you.
And I so appreciate it. And thank you. And for everybody out there, we're just so glad that you watched the interview. We thank you for being with us and ask that you join us again next week for another edition of Novelists Unwind. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.